Hi. Today I'm looking at a Toyota Matrix. The owner was complaining about some grinding noises coming from the front passenger side of the car. So I popped the wheel off and right away I noticed some significant gouging going on the rotor, and also that the brake pads are worn down to the backing plate. To get a better view of what's really going on and to inspect other parts other than just the brake pads and rotor, I'm going to start disassembly. First step is to remove these two bolts that hold on the caliper to the caliper bracket. I already loosened these earlier. These took a 14mm socket. Next, the caliper will have to be pried off using a pry bar, something like this. Be careful not to damage the braking hardware that's in here if you plan on reusing them. These are already broken. I plan on replacing them anyways, so I don't mind breaking them if necessary. To avoid damage to the rubber brake line, I am going to secure the brake caliper using some zip ties. Detailed inspection of the caliper shows that the boot and the caliper piston is ripped. Based on my experience, it'll be very difficult to retract this piston, and no doubt it's sticking. Hence why, most likely why this rotor and pads started wearing out prematurely. Just to confirm, I went to the driver's side of the vehicle and took the wheel off it. This rotor is a little bit rusty, but the braking surface is fine. And also, looking in there, I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but well, the parts have arrived, so now I can continue disassembling. The first thing that needs to be done, or the next thing that needs to be done rather, is to remove the two bolts here and here that hold on the caliper bracket. They take an 11/16 socket. I would like to point out the importance of these glide pins on the caliper bracket. Notice how they move in and out. This allows the caliper and brake pads to move along the rotor in this direction, and they keep the brake pads flush against the rotor. If these slide pins or glide pins are not easily movable like this and they're seized in there, what will happen is the brake pads, especially when the new brake pads are installed, may not actually sit flush against the brake rotor, and this can cause, one, premature wear on your brake pads and rotor. Second, it is very likely that the brakes would overheat, because during normal conditions it's possible that the brake pad would be in constant contact with the rotor. So it's very important that these are lubricated and moving very well like this. If they're not, you either have to remove these and get them greased, or you have to get a new caliper bracket. And the new caliper brackets usually come with new slide pins. So just to show how these pins come out, this little rubber boot just comes off, and then the slide pin is removed. See, these have lots of grease inside left, so I might add a little bit more grease just because I'm here, but that's the kind of motion that you're looking for on these glide pins. And now the rotor can be removed. If there's a little bit of corrosion preventing the rotor from coming off the hub, there's a couple things that can be done. One is you can go to the inside service and give this some light taps with a big hammer. Another thing that you can do is you can use a propane torch and a acetylene torch and heat the metal up. That is enough to usually expand the metal and break the rust. And then sometimes on some vehicles there's a little port that you can use a screw to push against the wheel hub, and that's enough to push the rotor off. This vehicle does not seem to have that though. The next task is to remove the old caliper. If your caliper is okay, then this obviously does not need to be done, and you can start reassembling your components. In order to remove the caliper, the first thing I like to do is I like to just use some vice grips and pinch off, just lightly pinch the brake hose here, and that'll minimize the brake fluid that leaks out of the hose and gets replaced with air. Next is to remove the screw that holds the brake line onto the caliper. This takes a 9/16 socket. Brake manufacturers and suppliers typically apply a thin coat of grease or oil on their rotors to prevent corrosion while they sit on the shelf. As you can see, there's a little bit of residue there. So this oil residue can go get on your brake pads, and it can inhibit the braking performance of them. So it's a good practice to give these a good cleaning with brake clean before they're installed. Now the brake caliper bracket can be reinstalled. These caliper bracket bolts require a lot of torque. I recommend checking on the internet for the torque specs for these bolts. For some reason, I don't have the old hardware that goes into these little grooves here on the caliper bracket. It's little tiny metal pieces that apply some tension to the brake pads and keep them from vibrating, keep them in place, things like that. So for some reason, my brake pads that I bought did not come with replacements. So I'm going to install them anyway and see how they feel. However, before throwing out your old hardware, make sure that your new pads have new hardware. So do as I say, not as I do. It's good practice to apply a little bit of grease on all these grooves on your caliper bracket. This will help reduce vibration, which causes that squeaking noise sometimes heard during hard braking. And also it'll just help your pads slide and not bind. So that way your pads should always be able to get flush against the rotor, and you're just going to have a longer life from your brake pads. Be careful not to touch the rotor braking surface whenever you're doing this. Now the new brake pads can be installed. Check it out. The new caliper came with a new caliper bracket with new glide pins. So I disassembled it real quick and put on the new bracket because I wanted these new slide pins. They're so nice. Anyway, now it's also good practice to put a dab of grease on the back of your brake pads as well. This will help with some of that vibration that I was talking about earlier. Just a very thin coat. Less is more in this case. So now it's time to install the new caliper. If you're using your existing caliper, you may notice that your caliper piston is quite extended, and it may be very difficult or impossible for you to get the existing caliper over your new pads, because the new pads are now so much thicker than your old pads. And so what you'll have to do is you'll have to retract this caliper piston. To do that, I like to use a C-clamp. Just put a C-clamp in here and use this backing surface as the support and slowly compress the caliper piston back, which will push some fluid back up into your system. If you find it difficult to do that, sometimes it helps if you remove the cap from your brake fluid reservoir. This will alleviate some of the pressure in the system and should make it a little bit easier to compress your cylinder. These bolts that hold the caliper onto the caliper bracket do not require as much torque as those that hold on the caliper bracket to the chassis. So just kind of nice and snug with your ratchet should be sufficient. But I recommend checking the torque specs if you can. So now the brake line should be connected to the new caliper. Make sure this little penis looking like thing goes into the little hole here. And don't lose this little clip. Now the clamp or vice grips, wherever you use, can be removed. So I'd like to point out, for those of you that had to change your caliper like I did, that whenever you change your caliper, you've potentially introduced some air into your brake line. Air is compressible, and thus whenever you press your foot on the brake pedal, that air compresses and takes away that nice solid feel that you had as compared to when the brake line is full of brake fluid. This makes your brakes feel mushy, and it actually can inhibit your braking performance as well. So it is important to get that air out of your brake lines. And how we do that is by doing a procedure called bleeding the brakes. And so if you're interested and want to know how to bleed your brakes, just see my other video, the link will be right about here. So have a good day, and thanks very much for watching. Bye now.